This video recently on natural laws and miracles, and I saw I should respond to it.
A ginormous pile of evidence to overcome all the evidence for the laws of nature as revealed to us by science.
Even if there is a God and that God performs miracles, they seem to be so rare that pretty much any other possible explanation is more probable. When presented with explanations that vary in probability, why wouldn't you go with the most probable one?
It's true that the evidence for a miracle would have to be greater than the evidence for an ordinary thing, but it doesn't seem true that the probability of a miracle is so low that no amount of testimony would ever be able to override that probability. Even if you don't think the Gospels do, I think it's still very possible that there would be some amount of testimony that would make it very likely that a miracle did occur.
Philosopher David Hume. David Hume famously argued that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony is of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish.
A miracle is a purported violation of a law of nature. This is impossible by definition because a law of nature is defined as a regularity that is never violated. If you ever see a violation of a law of nature, that would just mean that it wasn't really a law. Law of nature being broken, why would it not be more reasonable to infer that we were mistaken to believe it to be a law of nature to begin with? Scientists do sometimes observe phenomena that defy established laws of physics. The law of conservation of parity was once thought to apply to every fundamental force, but experiments show that the weak nuclear force violates it. When this happened, scientists did not interpret this to be a miracle. They just realized that what they thought was a universal law was not, in fact, universal.
A big problem I have with this video is the definition of what a natural law is. The definition of what a natural law is very complex, and there's multiple different answers. But this video seems to act like there's one clear and concise definition of what a natural law is. If we assume that by definition the natural law cannot be violated because it just describes whatever happens in the universe as a natural law, that still doesn't mean we can't take the best explanation about what happens. If someone claims to be from God and does something that violates our entire understanding of how the natural world works, then I think that's at least pretty good evidence that they're from God. To get back to his analogy about the Wu experiments, there's a difference between an experiment that shows that a law we thought was true was false, and coming back from the dead and claiming that you have a supernatural origin. So those two are not really all that similar. Even if the people behind the experiment, for some reason, claimed that they were doing some supernatural miracle, it still wouldn't be the same as what happened with Jesus, because what they would do was a repeatable experiment, which would not be the same thing as a miracle.
But I don't think his argument is the slam dunk that skeptics think that it is. What Hume is doing is he's presenting us with a false dilemma. As many of Hume's contemporary critics astutely have pointed out, you can't use the regular order of nature as evidence against miracles. Nonplussed by Hume's essay, William Adams wrote, "An experienced uniformity in the course of nature has always been thought necessary to the belief and use of miracles. These are indeed relative ideas. There must be an ordinary regular course of nature before there can be anything extraordinary. A river must flow before its stream can be interrupted. It is strange, therefore, that this uniformity, which is implied in the nature of a miracle, should at the same time be inconsistent with it."
Well, if you find an exception to what you thought was a uniformity, then that exception proves that it was not, in fact, a uniformity to begin with, by definition. That's why the observed violation of the law of conservation of parity wasn't declared a miracle. It just resulted in the revision of the law. If you want to convince me that a guy rose from the dead, I'd have to see his brain in a state of necrosis with my own eyes, and I'd have to directly witness him get up and walk around. Even then, while I would be convinced that resurrection is possible, I would still not infer that it was a miracle. I would rather infer that there was some heretofore undiscovered natural phenomenon that makes resurrection possible. And why shouldn't I? Why would that not be a perfectly reasonable inference?
On top of what I already said, we have way more experience of people dying and staying dead. So the odds that there is some unknown phenomenon that causes it to happen for seemingly no reason is very more unlikely than the weak nuclear force violating the conservation of parity. I might want to say that God's existence is just so improbable that even some unknown natural phenomenon would be more likelier than God actually resurrecting someone from the dead. But this is sort of a different debate. I don't think God's existence is that improbable, but that relies on a different argument.
And using less 18th century speak, here's an argument from philosopher Tim McGrew. Premise number 1. In religious contexts, miracles are supposed to function as signs. Premise 2. Miracles that function as signs would be impossible unless they took place against the backdrop of a stable order of nature, since that is what enables them to function as signs. Therefore, premise 3, the existence of a stable order of nature cannot be used as an argument against miracles in religious contexts.
But how would you tell the difference between a violation of a perceived regularity in nature being a sign from God and it being proof that said perceived regularity was not really a regularity at all? Should the scientists who discovered that the weak nuclear force violates the law of conservation of parity have interpreted that as God trying to tell them something?
No, because there's a difference between doing a scientific test that shows that what we originally thought was true was false and resurrecting from the dead. Not to mention there's no claim of a supernatural event occurring where there is when Jesus resurrected.
So if people were routinely rising from the dead, the resurrection of Jesus would lose all its cachet. It wouldn't be an event that could be distinguished from the way that nature operates normally, precisely because it is a massive interruption of the regularities of nature that we can actually appeal to the resurrection as God's vindication of the claims of Jesus of Nazareth to be God's son.
Even if Jesus did rise from the grave, one could interpret that as a corroboration of the idea that his Father is God, but it is not a vindication. The fact that he has the power to return from the dead in no way vindicates the idea that his Father is all-powerful. Again, even if I saw a guy rise from the dead, and even if he said his Father is God, I would still infer that something entirely natural was occurring. In fact, even if I believed in God, mere testimony would never convince me that a person rose from the dead, because God seems to resurrect people so rarely that the odds of that testimony coming from someone who is lying, mistaken, or delusional is still far more probable.
Why would a natural explanation be more probable? A natural explanation would imply that there's some unknown phenomenon that causes people to just come back from the dead, and one of the only times this had ever happened in history just so happened to be someone who apparently was able to predict it beforehand, without any way to predict it beforehand. So, well, it wouldn't be proof that God is all-powerful, but it would still be pretty strong evidence that what Jesus was saying was true.
Weren't dummies. They knew that virgins don't get pregnant, and dead people normally remain dead. You see, anyone can claim to speak for God using eloquent words. Muhammad dared his critics to write verses superior to the Quran as proof of its inspiration. And the Book of Mormon says that if you ask God to show you the truth, you'll sense a burning in your bosom that Mormonism is the real deal. I have to say I'm very sympathetic to those who find the Mormon or Muslim challenges unpersuasive, but turning water into wine or rising from the dead is another matter altogether. Nicodemus understood this when he said to Jesus, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs that you're doing if God were not with him."
Why not? Why is Nicodemus assuming that having the power to do exceptionally weird things can only be explained by those powers coming from God? If Nicodemus had met Chen Shengwu, the lady who ran the experiment that violated the law of conservation of parity, would he infer that she was sent from God as well?
He performed a repeatable experiment. That's not the same thing as a one-time resurrection that was claimed to be supernatural.
Consequently, in whatever degree it is probable, or not very improbable, that a revelation should be communicated to mankind at all, in the same degree it is probable, or not very improbable, that miracles should be wrought. Here's the bottom line. If there is a God, and he wants to make a revelation clear, then miracles aren't improbable. They're bound to happen at some point in history.
Since a miracle is a violation of a law of nature, and laws of nature by definition are never violated, the occurrence of miracles would effectively mean that there are no laws of nature. If there are no laws of nature to violate, then violations can't occur. In other words, miracles can't happen.
A miracle would just be defined as a supernatural agent interacting with the natural world. So you wouldn't have to have a violation of the laws of nature to happen in order for a miracle to occur. We just need some kind of sign that was in fact a miracle, which would usually require something that would go against what we know about the laws of nature. This doesn't mean that miracles can't happen, though.
I'll wrap up with this. Paley also argued that when a theorem is proposed by a mathematician, the first thing you want to do is test it. If your theorem doesn't match up with reality, then something went wrong somewhere and it's time to go back to the drawing board.
Well, you wouldn't test it unless it made claims that had empirical consequences. This is more likely something a physicist would do, not a mathematician.
It's something sketchy about Hume's reasoning, and we can prove that out by running a simple test case. Here's Paley again with a money quote. He says, "If 12 men whose integrity and good sense I had long known should seriously and circumstantially relate to me an account of a miracle wrought before their eyes, and in which it was impossible that they should be deceived."
Why would it be impossible that they be deceived? How could you possibly rule that out? Even if they have solid reputations for honesty, it wouldn't violate any laws of physics for them to be lying. So if they're saying a law of physics was broken, lying would still be more probable.
It seems like now the definition of a law of nature has changed, because now he's saying that if something violates the law of nature, then we shouldn't trust it. Even though earlier he said that if something violated the law of nature, it just meant our view of the law of nature was wrong. Maybe when he said laws of physics, he meant something other than the laws of nature, but he doesn't really make a clear distinction between those.
If the governor of the country, hearing a rumor of this account, should call these men into his presence and offer them a short proposal, either confess to the imposture or submit to be tied up to a gibbet. If they should refuse with one voice to acknowledge that there existed any falsehood or imposture in their case, if this threat was communicated to them separately, yet with no different effect, if it was at last executed, if I saw them myself, one after another, consenting to be racked, burned, or strangled, rather than to give up the truth of their account, still, if Mr. Hume's rule be my guide, I am not to believe them.
First of all, this is not analogous to what happened to the followers of Jesus. There is no evidence at all that they were persecuted specifically for their belief in the resurrection. Secondly, even if they were, that would still not convince me that a guy rose from the dead. The possibility that they were deceived would still be more probable. In fact, as unlikely as it seems, the possibility that they were lying would still be more probable to me than a guy actually returning from the dead.
Now I undertake to say that there exists not a skeptic in the world who would not believe them, or who would defend such incredulity.
Paley must not have met many skeptics.
Hume's in-principle argument sounds a lot like common sense, but it is vastly overrated. It's not the everlasting check that he proposes it out to be. Unless we want to beg the question for atheism, then there's no reason to assume that nature is left to itself. And you can't pit miracles against the laws of nature, because nature's laws are necessary for identifying a miracle.
But nature's laws can't identify a miracle, because if miracles occur, nature doesn't have any laws.
Nature still has constant repeatable patterns, so even if there are a few one-time events where God would interfere, that wouldn't mean there were no laws whatsoever.